You must have been.
Yeah, something. No, end of August. We only came back.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a discussion about this, but then I noticed that actually by the time I'll come here, the 90 days out of Schengen will be complete, which opens another window for another 90 days. So that's how it works. I didn't realize.
Genau.
Days in Rome.
Genau.
So December 5th into Rome.
Freie Zeit schon eingeplant.
So my nephew, my brother's son, friends, sons of friends.
Das ist schwierig.
Die haben eine andere.
Seeing my brother now and then seeing my best friends. Trying to see people. She probably knows some of my mom, but
Ja.
So it's yes, absolutely. This is a nice little.
Ja, ja, genau.
Es ist nicht, dass es nicht verlagert, sondern hier noch weiterführen. Some people might still be coming. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. For the event starting before Christmas, this is a very good one.
Ja.
Also von mir aus könnten wir loslegen.
Ja, wir können loslegen. Oh, I was realizing who is speaking like someone up there is suddenly speaking to us. Okay. May I ask you to pose with me in the picture as well?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Okay. Yeah, okay. But we will have a second.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
I don't forget about that.
Yeah.
I go first. Yeah, I understand. Thank you so much. Oh, yeah. You're old school too.
Yes, I'm old school.
Yeah, the business cards. Often there's this like, oh, business cards? Who does business cards? I do. Exactly. You went away, where's Mr. Lincoln? He's controlling things, he said, from his room.
the stream.
Yeah, but
He said he would be in his office controlling the stream.
oh, and it's already green, which means he's probably started.
Okay.
I don't know. Should we start?
Yeah.
All right. Guten Abend, good evening, dobry večer. This evening's event will be in English, as has been announced previously. I'm Jochen Kleinschmidt from Technical University of Dresden, a co-organizer of this lecture series with my colleagues here. And of course, the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine is probably the most important challenge that Europe and the world will be facing during our lifetimes. And I'm very happy that today we have invited Volodymyr Dubovik, who is Professor of International Relations at the National University at Odessa. He is also visiting professor at Tufts University in Massachusetts in the United States and a senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. And he is certainly one of the Ukrainian international relations scholars with the widest presence in Western media. I'm very happy we could bring you to Eichstätt, and Professor Dubovik will be speaking about Russia's war on Ukraine and the European Security Order. Without further ado, I would, yes, I have to add, there will be another event with Volodymyr, which will be more in a Q&A format, organized by the chair for theology of Professor Kropacz here, which will be titled What Ukrainians Are Fighting For and Why They Can't Just Quit. This event will take place on Wednesday, 20th December at 7 p.m. At the Foyer Marktplatz 7 in Eichstätt. Volodymyr, the podium is yours. Thank you.
He already is sharing some of those flyers to the room about another talk that I'm going to have here. Okay, good, great. Thank you so much, Jochen, and good evening, everyone. And I hope you are able to hear me and see me fine. Yes, thank you for coming. I mean, of course, for us Ukrainians, for the last 20 months or so, it's always a very special feeling when you have to address the audience here or there. I've been speaking in various countries through the last period of almost 2 years soon. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but that's how it is. The war will turn, the big war, the large-scale war will turn 2 years in February, which is just around the corner. So no one is expecting it to end before that time, unfortunately. So we can definitely project that there will be 2 years and more in counting. And actually one of the questions that lingering in our minds is like, how long is going to be? And no one really knows. And still, that's still the case, you know. And unfortunately, oftentimes we experts and scholars, we get this question like, how long do you think it will continue? And we don't know. I mean, because every time I hear someone or I read an article where someone says, this war, I tell you exactly how it's gonna end and when, I actually stop doing that. And I recommend to my colleagues and students always, like, stop reading it, because no one really knows. There are so many unknowns, there are so many variables, there are so many factors that are shaping into how it will continue, that you can't quite know, you know, how exactly it will end, along which division lines, resulting in what kind of document maybe, like a peace treaty or ceasefire or something like that, or without it, or maybe it will just continue. You know, I might actually also remind you that the war was on before February last year, just a different type of scale. Russia actually attacked Ukraine in February and spring of 2014. So the war was raging for 8 years, full 8 years, before Russia escalated it to a full-scale war against Ukraine in February last year. So that's how it is, and that's one of the opportunities, by the way, that the war will actually subside
in the scale and level of hostilities, and that will continue as a more of a low-intensity conflict like it was in Donbass for 8 years before that. We just don't know because there are so many things that we need to consider. But I have to talk about it because it's on my mind, obviously, as someone who's from Ukraine, who's Ukrainian, who haven't been home for a long time now to my hometown Odessa, and so our lives have been changed in so many ways, millions and millions of Ukrainians. Even though I haven't been under like bombing or shelling, I wasn't ever hiding in a bomb shelter, you know, in a basement of the house or anything like that, unlike millions of other Ukrainians who did. But I can say, I'll tell you quite frankly that my life was also changed in so many ways, in numerous ways by this war. But also I'm a scholar, and sometimes it's really hard even, you know, to kind of leave your emotions aside for a moment and talk about the war in an abstract way, like I would talk about the war in a distant land, which has no connection to me. I can do that. Sometimes emotions show, I guess. You'll see which side I'm on. There's no secret about it. But at the same time, I need to somehow distance a little bit from the subject and to try to analyze it in a more calm, cool, analytical manner. That's what I'm trying to do. So the war is raging, and of course it's the biggest war in Europe by far since the end of Cold War, since the end of the Second World War. You know, we of course had conflict in Europe here and there since the end of Cold War, for instance, in the former Yugoslavia, but it's nothing comparing to what you see in scale between Russia and Ukraine, in terms of number of people involved on both sides fighting, in terms of weapons being used, you know, missiles flying, battleships and everything, taking part, strategic bombers, launching missiles and stuff like that. None of that we saw in the former Yugoslavia at any point in this conflict. It was mostly, you know, those kind of on-land detachments in much smaller numbers. So, and I actually just remember a saying which was uttered by someone quite known in world history, American history. He left lingering effects about his personality when he was gone. That was Richard Nixon, who in early 90s, he said, when people contemplated what would happen if Russia and Ukraine go against each other in a war. And he said that there would be some kind of war that would make former Yugoslavia wars as a little quarrel of a kindergarten kids on the side of the road in comparison. So it's interesting because he said that like in 92 or 93 or something like that. You know, and now we see that he was right with all the horror of former Yugoslavia, with all the horror of Srebrenica and Vukovar and other places. You know, what is happening now in Ukraine is, you know, it's absolutely incomparable scale. You know, you have one major military power going against another, which is quite a military power in itself, and you can see, and fought back actually resolutely at the beginning of the conflict at least, and still fighting back. You know, so middle power, Ukraine is the middle power. You know, in our field of international relations, we often refer to this hierarchy of countries. There is a superpower at the top, which has like all sorts of power, including usually nuclear power. Then there are great powers, and of course Germany is among them. And I'll be happy actually to talk about Germany later, or maybe in our Q&A session. The role of this country in these times I think is huge. I think it's growing. You know, I think responsibility and awareness even in this country about the special role that might belong to Germany is also growing. And then there's middle power where Ukraine is, and then there are kind of small powers that often too can play a role, by the way, especially if they coalesce together. By the way, one of the things we've been seeing is, of course, number of countries who are middle powers and even small countries, small powers getting together to help Ukraine. You know, you've seen the 3 Baltic countries. You know, you've seen, of course, Finland, Sweden. You've seen Romania, Bulgaria. You know, they're not necessarily big actors, big players, but if you put them together, you know, and they're working together to help Ukraine, that's a different situation. Of course, all of those countries are mentioned, except for Sweden for now, are members of NATO. They also belong to this alliance, and the alliance has a big role, and I'll talk about it as well in my conversation with you today. But even as individual countries, if they get their act together, they can do a lot. You know, like we know now, for instance, that in the first days of war, in late February last year and early March last year, Bulgaria all of a sudden shuffled a lot of weapons into Ukraine without even announcing it. You know, and that we only realized somewhat later. So they actually helped us to live through the most difficult days of the war. Bulgaria, where actually you have quite a sizable pro-Russian sentiment in the public and among political elites as well. So that's surprising, and a lot of things are surprising us in this war. Like if you talk about European security, you would, for instance, normally count some countries in Europe very soft on Russia, very rarely critical of Russian behavior, definitely not some kind of Cold War warriors, not that much pro-American, but they actually came out strongly in support of Ukraine. And to me, often the most visible and most interesting example would be some countries of the Southern Europe that are not necessarily the most active and not the most advanced, not the most affluent, rich countries in Europe, but they actually came up strongly in support of Ukraine. You know, and again, if you think about it, Portugal and Spain, and then Italy, and then Greece, you would think, you know, normally, oh, wow, they are really soft in Russia, and you know, they're not going to do things that are hurting Russia or supporting Ukraine in this case. But they are. But they are actually, not only in terms of their political elites, but also if you look at the sociological opinion polls in those countries, people are constantly coming up with strong numbers in support of Ukraine, and they are all sending weapons, you know, to Ukraine. And Italy, for instance, the current Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, when she was being elected, we were terrified in Ukraine because she actually belonged to this kind of a far-right political spectrum, part of political spectrum, where you often find people sympathetic of Putin. Because we normally have some sympathy for Putin and Russia on two kind of extremes, two poles there, you know, far left and far right. But in this case, we were actually terrified because we thought that she's going to undermine and, you know, unravel the entire pro-Ukraine coalition, and maybe she would block the sanctions that by European Union against Russia. But she didn't. On the contrary, she came out as a very strong and vocal supporter of supporting Ukraine, defending Ukraine, and aiding Ukraine. So Greece, for all, you know, very strong pro-Russian sentiments always in this country, which go back, including like cultural links and religious links and other things. But Greece is now basically one of the major supporters and major hub, actually, in providing Western assistance to Ukraine. Because one major hub, of course, is Poland. A lot of stuff going into Ukraine, including weapons, through Poland, but a lot of it is going actually through south, through Greece, through Adrianopolis, and the big port there, which is now the major NATO and US hub of logistics, kind of, you know, corridor or channel or route into Ukraine, also providing weapons. Much of it is actually going through Romania and Bulgaria and into my region of Odessa across the Danube. You know, that's why early in the war Russia actually shelled and bombed so much the railways there and the bridges near my hometown of Odessa. And of course now in the recent months they've bombed a lot port facilities in Odessa city itself, and Ukrainian ports on the Danube River, several Danube River ports, who can somehow substitute. If Russia blockades the Black Sea ports, then we can kind of use the Danube River ports. So that's why Russia was actually bombing a lot places like Izmail, Reni, Uzdunaisk, and some others, smaller ports, river ports on Danube. So the war, of course, I think is changing European security. In which way, it's still hard to say, because among other things, you know, like I said, we're not Cassandras, you know, or Nostradamuses. Those times are gone. You know, it's hard to be, to try to be one, you know, some kind of a prophet who sees into the future. We don't have, you know, the crystal ball. All we have is this glass, you know, and actually I'm gonna pour some water into it, and then again it's gonna be this famous situation, half full or half empty. Yeah, and that's how it is now in our conversation. about the future European security order and how the ongoing Russia's war against Ukraine is affecting it. Much of what we'll see out of European security architecture in the future depends on how the war ends and when it ends. So that's one of the reasons why we're not 100% sure, right, what kind of impact we're going to see. If Russia's going to prevail, if Ukraine is going to prevail, is going to be a stalemate, what kind of stalemate? Is it going to be fragile peace, or is it going to be more or less a lasting, durable peace? It's hard to say right now. So, and even in terms of like what is win and what is loss, you know, people in my field now are been talking about this and contemplating these terms for the last 20 months. It all depends on how you define it. Because, for instance, let's take Ukraine. We don't liberate, imagine we don't liberate all of the lands that is currently occupied in Ukraine by Russia. So that's probably a loss for us, especially considering that we had tall expectations, especially considering that Zelensky himself and our government set a bar high of expecting that Ukrainian troops will probably be able to liberate all occupied lands by Russia in Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass. Okay, so if we fall short of this objective, then is it a failure or is it a victory for Moscow? But then on the other hand, if you go back to the last days of February 2022, when Putin actually wanted to be in Kiev within several days, when he launched his attacks from various directions, and he wanted to change the government, he wanted to depose Zelensky, our current president, put someone else in his place, some kind of puppet government which will be completely controlled, some kind of a puppet government, and he'll be pulling strings from Moscow, and this government would control Ukraine, and he thought there would be millions and millions of collaborators in Ukraine working with Russian troops. None of that happened. Ukraine is still there. Russia controls little under 20% of Ukraine's territory. Much of it going back to 2014. Actually, if you include Crimea and Russia-occupied parts of Donbass. So actually from the land that Russia captured in February and March last year, Ukraine has already liberated little over half of it. A lot of times people don't understand that. You know, so actually if you only look at the land that Russian troops conquered since February 24th, 2022, up to this present day, Ukraine has liberated something like 55–60% of it, so little over half of it. So it's not definitely then in that light, and it's not a win for Russia, because we're talking about a big country, military country, huge country, superpower in a way, in some senses, just great power in other senses. It's an asymmetric conflict. We're now seeing it more and more. It remains an asymmetric conflict. What does it mean? It means that you have one very strong country, look at the map, the territory, then vast natural resources. Russia is still selling a lot of stuff internationally, so they can fund the war, basically indefinitely. That's another problem. We now see that the instruments, the tools we can use to affect, to try and impact, have an influence on behavior of such an actor are limited. If they're really stubborn, if they really made up their mind, they want to do this and that, then it's limited. They have their own resources. The sanctions that have been put on Russia, that's a good thing to do. I think the sanctions should stay, even if they're not altering Russian behavior. You know, that's another thing, because people often wonder, and there is a big discussion about the sanctions, like some people would say, but Russia is still attacking Ukraine. We don't see any evidence that our sanctions are working. Should we do away with sanctions? That's a big debate in the field. And some people say, sure, yes. I mean, if they're not working, then what's the point? Because they're actually hurting us as well. Right, you know, our economies, and some jobs are lost in countries, in European countries, for instance, because of sanctions against Russia. But then again, people say, okay, look, first of all, this is a big country, of course, Russia. They got ready for this. Now it's obvious that Putin was preparing his economy to some extent for this occasion of sanctions being implemented on Russia. Second of all, you know, no sanctions ever work overnight. You know, they only work, or sometimes don't work, over a longer period of time. I mean, look at some countries that have been living under sanctions for a long time, like North Korea, like Iran. You know, if Iran is surviving, the same regime in power, after so many years of very harsh sanctions, you know, what to say about Russia? You know, because they have this massive economy that they can rely on. And unfortunately, they're also now building more weapons. You know, what is happening in Russia, unfortunately, in many ways, is something reminiscent, reminding us of the times of the Second World War, when the Soviet Union has managed to completely transform its economy to the kind of war tracks and war rails. And that's what they're doing now. You know, indeed, they're producing now more shells and everything else than they were before the war. That's not what we expected to see. That's not what we hoped to see when the war was starting. We thought that maybe they would just diminish the supply, they will be exhausted, the economy will be in ruins because of the sanctions. That's not what is happening. And that's why you have Mr. Putin, who just the other day, I think a couple of days ago, he was at this speaking event when he actually spoke for a long time. And he said that he is very confident that he's going to win. But then again, what is a win? So if Ukraine continues to exist as an independent nation, as a sovereign nation, moreover, still having a chance to become maybe a European Union member, as we know, actually there's been another major milestone in the relations between Ukraine and the EU, where European Commission announced they're going to be actually opening the process of negotiations with Ukraine about the membership. Again, I'll probably go back to the EU subject a little later in the talk. So it doesn't mean that Ukraine is going to be a member anytime soon, but still it's a major milestone in that direction, and for Ukraine, therefore, it matters a lot. And you know, if you consider all of that, and then it's not a win, clearly not a win for Kremlin. They've thrown so much resources into Ukraine. You know, they lost so many soldiers already, they lost so much military equipment, and so on, and still it's not a win. You know, look at the Black Sea. That's another thing. I mean, so unsurprisingly, Zelensky often refers to it for a good reason, because Russia had complete domination of the Black Sea militarily before the war. You know, Ukraine basically doesn't have a navy. We lost most of our battleships in 2014 when Russia went in and took over Crimea, so most of Ukrainian battleships actually were lost then in the spring of 2014 and early summer of 2014. So we don't have much to speak about in terms of Ukrainian Navy. Russia, on the contrary, has a contemporary kind of modern style Navy in the Black Sea. Moreover, they brought some ships from other seas. Closer to February 24th, 22, they brought 6 large landing ships, 3 from Baltic and 3 from Northern Sea. And that's when people thought, okay, they're getting ready for the big war, they may be getting ready for the amphibious landing operation, something like that. But on the contrary, what we saw now is their navy is completely irrelevant. You know, they cannot get anything out of this domination in numbers. Moreover, because Ukraine now has missiles, anti-ship missiles, some given to us by our Western allies, and some produced in Ukraine, the Neptunes. We can find and hunt down, you know, Russian battleships, basically at any point, almost at any point near our border, our coastline, that's for sure. That's why they're hiding. That's why not only they are most of the time in Sevastopol and they are based in Crimea, but these days they actually moved most of their naval assets into Novorossiysk, Russia proper, even further east, away from Ukrainian missile strikes. So that's amazing. You know, as you probably have heard, you know, I'm sure a lot of people around the world have heard about that. Last April, last year, they lost their battleship, the flagship, the cruiser, Moskva, you know, which they completely didn't expect to happen. So yeah, it's actually changing a lot of thinking about the naval warfare. You know, do you need the ships actually, because they're actually very costly, and you can't make and produce many quickly. And so Ukraine would be unrealistic to expect that someone would help us to create a strong fleet, navy of battleships anytime soon. It's going to take time, in the best case, right, scenario. But yeah, in the US, I talked to a lot of people, including at Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, some others who were thinking, we are now rethinking completely what we thought before about naval warfare because of what we're seeing happening in the Black Sea, how one country completely dominates and expects complete control over the sea, and then Russia has nothing out of it, out of their numbers of battleships. Moreover, the battleships become sitting ducks, as Americans say, the targets where Ukrainians can target them. It's actually that they haven't lost more ships is primarily because the Ukrainian leadership decided not to launch more missiles. quite frankly. You know, so we understand if we maybe down another ship, there will be another rain of Russian missiles on Ukrainian cities, so we don't want that, right? So, but at the same time, logistically speaking, in terms of like, can we do that? We can. We can actually, at the moment we're speaking now, we can launch more missiles and maybe down more Russian battleships. So that's really rewriting a lot of military strategy and so on. And this war has been studied, I can assure you, in many, many military academies around the world already as we speak, because people are trying to make some lessons, drawing some lessons from it. And the one major lesson is a big war like this is possible, because a lot of people thought it's not possible. You know, a lot of people said, okay, we're going to have some wars out there, of course. Maybe we would never live in the world without wars, unfortunately. That's people realize that much. But that there will be a war of this size, of this scale, you know, with hundreds of thousands of heavily armed, equipped people on both sides. Maybe not. A very conventional war, too. So on one hand, it's a very modern war. If you look at the role that the drones are playing, if you look at the role the computers are playing, you know, no one is fighting, neither Ukrainians nor Russians, without drones, without computers, without trying to see what enemy is doing and where exactly we have to hit our targets. And Ukraine, of course, assisted by our Western allies, Americans and others, who are helping us to pinpoint the targets for our strikes. So Russians don't have that benefit, but they have some contemporary military equipment on their own. And they actually been very, you know, they've been very boisterous about it. They've been very proud that they invested billions and billions into their military force over years. And then in the end, they're not getting that much of a bang for it. So that's an American expression. So they're not getting much of the benefit for all this investment they made into their military. Partially because it's not enough, partially because it was stolen, because, you know, a lot of times you hear in the press about Ukraine being corrupt, but believe me, Russia is corrupt too, and maybe actually much more corrupt than Ukraine is. So therefore, much of that money being, you know, appropriated for Russian military has been just stolen by some people. They never reached, you know, the military itself. So the war of this size is possible, therefore we need to get ready for it. Because, of course, in Europe, everyone was living for a long time in times of what scholars often call a peace dividend, meaning the Cold War ended. It was, you know, seemingly friendly and peaceful and no big problems on the horizon. You know, some problems here and there, mostly outside of Europe. You know, let's say Afghanistan or maybe Northern Africa, or, you know, of course in the 1990s in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia, I mentioned that. But outside of that, not much trouble, you know, in Europe itself or in the immediate vicinity, you know, periphery of Europe. But now people wake up in a very rude manner, like, you know, yeah, this is possible. And one European major country is doing it, another against European country. Ukraine is the biggest, by territory, is the biggest European country, you know, if you don't count Russia. You know, if it's Russia, number one, if Russia is included in Europe, I guess it's supposed to be, it has lands in Europe. But then Ukraine is number two, or if you don't count Russia, Ukraine is number one. You know, so you're basically talking about the two largest European, one Eurasian, one just European country fighting against each other. And remembering the words of Richard Nixon. And the front line that we have is huge. Someone early in the war made an experiment. They said, okay, let's calculate how many miles or kilometers you have along the front line between Ukraine and Russia. Let's make a straight line and put it on the map of the rest of Europe. And that line stretched from Warsaw to Madrid. You know, can you imagine that? So it's basically encompassing the entire Europe. That's how long the front line is. And in most points along these front lines, there are hostilities right now. So it's not like only one here and only one there. No, it's actually a massive amount of hostilities. And Russia is now trying to recapture initiative, as we know. So that's one main lesson. Another main lesson is that Europeans have to think about themselves and their security, like what they're going to do. How important is American participation in all of this? And that's a very timely question because of Donald Trump, because of some people in the United States who are saying that maybe US should actually detach itself from European security, from Europe completely, stop helping Ukraine, That's what he's saying. That was people in his corner of the Republican Party are saying. Not all Republicans are like that. There are some still old school Republicans, who are very, traditionally in a classic way. They're very strong on national security. They have their own worries and suspicions about Russia, and they want Ukraine and want U.S. to play a major role in international affairs. There are some like this, but there is more and more of this different crowd, different type, new generation of Republicans concentrated to focus on Trump, and Trump is their leader, and he's basically saying, get out of the rest of the world. And that's what he was trying to do for the 4 years of presidency when he was the president. There have been some paradoxes there, too. For instance, Ukraine received mortar weapons from lethal weapons. Mortar weapons, something else. Lethal weapons from U.S. first time when Trump was president. So he was convinced by some of his generals and some people in his inner circle. Surprising, he was under investigation for ties with Russia, and that's why he thought maybe, okay, if I now allow some weapons to be given to Ukraine, that would probably take some hit out of me, if you like, because the people would stop saying I'm pro-Russian, because what do you mean I'm pro-Russian? I just signed a authorization to give some weapons to Ukraine. But that's a little detail. If you want this, we can go back to this, because of course Trump continues to be a major presence in Ukraine-American relations for a number of years now. So what questions we had before this war is is America relevant at all? Is it a declining power? Is it a country that still can provide some leadership, maybe, to the rest of Euro-Atlantic Western community or not? Would such leadership be needed? Those were big questions if you think about American role. And answers have been received. And they are positive answers. They're yes in both cases. First of all, they are needed. I mean, American presence is needed because, like it was actually in the 1990s. You might remember, all people older in this room or people who study these subjects in your classes, that Europeans by themselves struggled with what was happening, for instance, in former Yugoslavia. And they actually begged and asked and dragged Americans, Bill Clinton administration at that point of time, to actually be part of trying to do something about it. And quite reluctantly, Clinton decided, okay, we're going to be part of this process in Bosnia and elsewhere. And the Dayton Agreement had been signed and so on. No accident there that Dayton, Ohio was chosen. Therefore, Americans been now providing this leadership. For instance, for one thing, they've been seeing Russia as congregating troops on Ukrainian borders ever since fall, actually late October 2021. And they've been, ringing the alarm. They've been saying Russians are preparing for invasion. What we're seeing is that they're preparing for invasion. Unfortunately, not much of that alarm was heeded, neither here in Europe nor in Ukraine. President Zelensky at that point of time thought that maybe Americans are mistaken, that maybe Russians are more in the business of intimidating Ukraine, trying to force some concessions out of Ukraine and not actually preparing for massive invasion. Most of European allies, including this country, they agreed more with Kyiv than in Washington. They said Americans are unnecessarily alarmist, that Russia is just using its military forces like it did before many times, actually, in just trying to pressure Ukraine to maybe doing something on Donbass and other things. But it turned out Americans were right. But more importantly, they were actually putting together this pro-Ukraine coalition of countries. They've been putting together the sanctions regime. They've been putting together the plans for the military supply, the weapon supply. If Russia attacks Ukraine on a massive scale, then on day one, all of this that was prepared, put in the works, will start working. So that was a big deal, because on February 24th, Europeans and Americans together, they didn't have to start from scratch, from zero. Much of the preparatory work was already done, and that's to the credit of Washington, of Biden administration. And then, of course, when the war started, there was this famous episode. I don't know. It's more like an anecdote, really. It's more like a rumor. It's not necessarily supported by facts, because no one was in the room to record it with audio or video. That one of the ministers in the German government actually said, why should we support Ukraine on February 24th, 25th last year? Ukraine's going to fall any day now. So what's the point of supporting Ukraine if Russia's going to just prevail within days? Wouldn't there be a futile effort? Why would we even do that? And that episode showing us like what the previous example actually a year earlier in 21 was American withdrawal from Afghanistan, which very much informed Western thinking about places like Afghanistan and Ukraine. And we in Ukraine for a number of, like half a year, say between August 21 and February 22, we've been trying to tell the world that Ukraine is not Afghanistan in many ways, in terms of nation building, in terms of military preparedness, in terms of scale of corruption, and many other things. We're different, all right? So we're actually going to fight for our freedom if we are attacked. But what happened in Afghanistan, really informed and influenced the thinking in the West, definitely in Washington, but also many other Western capitals about what's going to happen in Ukraine. If Afghan government, which had army and military forces and police forces, something like 300,000 people, I think, against this very small number of Talibs, actually, if it's unraveled like within days, then Ukraine, what's the chance? Look at the mess, right? Look at the mathematics, look at the numbers, sheer numbers that Russia has and Ukraine has. Ukrainians have no chance, So basically, not only Germans, but also Americans have been kind of waiting for the how few first days of the war will go, and Americans shared this analysis that Kyiv will fall. The last thing that Ukrainian leaders saw and heard in Washington right on the eve of this massive invasion is like, we're sorry, guys, we're with you, we have a lot of sympathy, but, you're going to fall. They're going to take Kyiv, there's no doubt about that. So, and of course, that Mr. Zelensky was offered to be evacuated from Kyiv because the Russian troops were getting closer, but he decided to stay. So that was a very major moment in Ukrainian contemporary history, how he decided to stay. And of course, speaking about Zelensky, and of course, in the course of our conversation today, I'll be happy to answer any questions related to him. But whatever one thinks about him, whether you like it or not, did you like him before the war? Did you start liking him when the war started, or whatever? He played his role, by staying quite resolutely, not going and uttering something like, I'm not looking for a right, I'm looking for ammunition. Now, historians now question if he actually said those words, but that was a meaning of the message that he returned to Americans and others who said, well, Russian troops are coming to Kyiv. If they capture you, there's going to be a problem. So you're a legally elected president, and we need to have you safe, so maybe somewhere away from front lines, so maybe not abroad, but let's say Western Ukraine. Maybe you could relocate and go there. And he said, I'm not going anywhere. And Ukrainian government stayed, and most Ukrainian people stayed and showed up for work. And that's how this miracle of resilience in Ukraine happened in February and March of last year. This resilience has been tested now in Ukraine. In surprising ways, maybe it's more difficult times and period of the war now than it was in February and March of 2022. Because at that point of time, we were all consolidated. We're all fought back, military and civilians. Now the patience is wearing thin. Like, how long can we actually sustain this? How many people are we going to lose in the front line? Some of the best and bravest Ukrainian soldiers, most prepared and most motivated, already dead or wounded, so they're not back on the front line. Economy is in ruins, but of course, every day of the war is ruining economy more and more. The moment when Ukrainian economic recovery might start after the war is being delayed because the war is ongoing, right? So we're not talking about recovery, meaningful recovery right now, because how you can expect anyone in the West, for instance, to give money to recover, to put some new plants and factories in Ukraine if the next day Russian missile might come in and destroy that new facility. So therefore, of course, there's no recovery right now. So that's a huge problem then. That's a huge problem then that you have. With the war, but resilience is still there. Even if you look at the sociological opinion polls, Ukrainians are very reluctant to the idea that we should give away any land to the Russians. Because for most reasons, and I'll be actually focusing on this kind of things on Wednesday, for many reasons, but one of the reasons that we know what kind of fate befalls on Ukrainians on occupied lands. Because we found out early enough about Bucha and other places, but there are hundreds of Buchas in Ukraine. Everywhere you liberated some land where Russians were in control for a certain period of time, you find massive war crimes. You have this graves, mass graves in the forests and so on, and people disappearing, some not even found, some not identified up to the present moment. So that's the kind of destiny that you kind of say, okay, fine, if we're not going to try and liberate these people, that's how they're going to live under Russian occupation, because actually Russian occupiers are terrible occupiers, because under international law, if you occupy certain land, you have responsibility. You have to provide certain basic amenities and services for the people, like healthcare, for instance, like food supply, like water supply. They don't care much about that in occupied land, so that's a problem. So NATO has been really energized since the start of the war, but of course the war is not about NATO, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But the eastern flank of NATO has been energized for a good reason. There have been some debates and reforms going on within NATO, because previously for a number of years, decades really, the focus was on containing Russia if Russia becomes militaristic, aggressive and belligerent, containing, maybe deterring Russia from going into any member state. Right now the focus is actually on defense. They're trying to shift the focus on defending the land, because of course if you stick to the previous approach and Russia attacks, say, Estonia, all right, by the time you would mobilize the resources, you would trigger the response mechanism within NATO, the Russian tanks would be like halfway across Estonia, maybe entire Estonia will be taken. So that's not good enough, all right? If the Russians are now betting on a full-scale military invasion, that's not good enough. You actually need to have some forces on the ground. And that's what they're doing, in Baltics, in Finland. Finland is very open as a new member, of course. They're very serious about their defense. They always have been, even while formally being neutral. You probably know the term Finlandization. During the Cold War times, what it meant, that they didn't have any security, foreign policy, defense quarrels with Russia, but politically, economically, and so on, they were very much anchored in the West, like in Europe and with America and so on. But right now it's different, it's changing. There's no Finlandization anymore. One immediate result, of course, of the Russian invasion into Ukraine last year was that Finland and Sweden immediately applied for membership in NATO. Understanding Sweden the same way, by the way, also very serious about their defense and spending tons of money on new weapons and training their military. But even these two countries that are much more serious about their army and armed forces, they understood that if they are against Russia eye to eye, not much of a chance. So because it's a huge military machine that you have in Russia, so therefore you need support of this collective security arrangement alliance, collective defense, collective security called NATO. So that's what you have now. I mean, you have heavier presence. Finland is very much open to American bases and others on the territory of Finland. Romanians are very active, of course, even prior to that, because of American operations in Iraq, Afghanistan for many years. Romania played a very serious role in that, what they call the force projection in military circles into the Middle East. But right now, Romanians are active and Bulgarians are split in many ways. I mentioned that already. Turkey is maneuvering and balancing in the region. That's a lot of stuff there happening in the Black Sea. In my corner of the world, my city is actually on the Black Sea, Odessa. So a lot of things happen in the Black Sea, and it's also very hard to say like how it's gonna end. Moldova, small neighboring country close to Odessa, basically within miles from my hometown, is also going through some very serious transformations. They're basically finding their new identity, that they belong to the West, that they should be part of the European Union. They've been invited together with Ukraine a few days ago. Negotiations will be open about membership for Moldova. It's a small country. It's going to be relatively easy to digest for European Union. So you can be optimistic about Moldova within a meaningful time frame becoming part of European Union. It's a different kind of line of thinking about NATO. Formally Moldovans say we don't need NATO membership right now, but it might change as well. And of course, they have unresolved problems. They have a breakaway region, Russia-controlled enclave in Pridnestrovia or Transnistria, in the southeast of Moldova, which can be resolved, actually by force now easily. To tell you the truth, if Moldovans and Ukrainians decide within themselves and supported by the West, there will be no self-proclaimed Transnistria Republic like within a day or two. but because it's doable. Russia has no way of supplying them with arms or anything right now, because it's like cut away from the rest of Russia, of course. But we're not doing it because, of course, there are people living there and so on. There will be victims, so no one's trying to do it. But in Chisinau, so happened this year. I've been several times in Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, and I talked to my colleagues and experts and people in the government. I actually happen to know quite a few of them, the National Security Advisor, Stanislav Secretariero, and also Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nicu Popescu, is a good old friend, but others as well. They said, for a while we sat on our suitcases, and we thought that Russian troops are going to come here, and we're going to just have to leave. But because Ukrainians actually put together this response, military response, and stopped Russian offensive, we relaxed, and we're kind of now grateful to you, for you doing that at the high price, at the high cost. Look, we're talking about European security, but look at the immediate vicinity of Ukraine. Look at the Belarus. We have a tyrant in power who remains in power unelected. He's crushing everyone, he's killing people, people disappearing, some people went abroad, they're happy and lucky in that respect. Others are, just rotting in the jails, thousands of them. The massive human rights violations. He's completely in power only because he is very loyal to Russia, to Putin. Belarus was unfortunately used as a major jumping ground in aggression against Ukraine. So in addition to a long border with Russia, which was already way too long for our taste, you also got now Belarus, and of course Russian troops make their move out of Belarus as well into Ukraine. And that's why now we have to continue to keep some of our troops in the north of Ukraine, just in case if Russians try to come via Belarus again. And we kind of need those troops now in the east and the south, but we can't completely, take them away from a near Belarusian border because Russia might attack there. So, but Belarus is again, as Ukraine is victorious and Russia is defeated, then Belarus has a chance of a freedom in the future. They can actually get rid of this regime for good. They can actually have some free and fair elections, once in their lifetime, because basically Lukashenko is there, of course, from since early 1990s. So that's how much it hinges actually on all of this. Like the South Caucasus is really influenced as well by this war. Azerbaijan has been emboldened in many ways, including Russia being preoccupied with Ukraine so much that they understood that Russia would not intervene in whatever kind of problem of fighting they have with Armenia. Georgia is in different league, actually very pro-Ukrainian, strong ally of Ukraine for a long time. Now, on the contrary, headed by the government, which is very soft on Russia and very reserved in their public statements about Russia-Ukraine war. In the Central Asia, for instance, if we go on, in the former Soviet Union region, then they are also very much looking and watching closely what's happening in the war. Early in the war, when they saw that Russian troops being defeated and killed in massive numbers by Ukrainians, that really emboldened them in unusual ways. You remember last year there have been a number of meetings between Putin and Central Asian presidents, and those people would usually be very loyal. They'll be clients to Russia. They'll be just asking Russia for some support here or there, maybe some oil, maybe some gas, maybe something else. But this times they were actually talking to him like equals, and they were actually demanding some respect. And he was sitting in a room, you see it in the video, he was like puzzled, like what's going on with these people? Like they never talked to me this way, but that's because the Russian invasion of Ukraine exposed the shortcomings and weaknesses of Russian military, of Russian political system, of how much they can do with all their military might. They've been bracing themselves for this for a long time, but now, well, there is a limit to what they can do. Like today, of course, Russians would love to continue their aggression and take, say, Kharkiv and Odessa, my hometown, and maybe Kyiv if they can, but they can't for the time being. I mean, they're hoping that maybe Ukraine would unravel and would be weakened, and maybe there'll be no Western supply, no Western support in the coming months and years. And Russia, in the meantime, would actually use the money they're generating from sales of their natural resources and also the weapons that they produce in their factories and plants, and they would actually have another chance of going at such places like Kharkiv and Odessa and Kyiv. They hope so, but for now, they can't. So therefore, there's a really serious limit what they can do. So going back to our conversation about victory or defeat, what does it even mean? I spoke about Ukraine. So Ukraine surviving as an independent sovereign state, maybe not with all its territory intact, but that's already kind of win for Ukraine, if you're considering the initial goals of Russia. Because Putin has been saying from day one, and he's still saying, there is no such thing as Ukraine. The Ukrainian state is an aberration. It shouldn't be existing. It's a mistake. You know, it's all our land. Plus in the West, maybe they should go back to like Poland and Hungary and like Romania, some of Ukrainian lands. And he says there is no Ukrainian nation. And there is no such thing as Ukrainian language. So basically that's why, and then you first think about these war crimes, massive war crimes, and you put it together like 2 + 2, you know, well, it looks like a genocide, you know. Like, but I mean, I'm not saying that the aim of Russia is to kill all Ukrainians. I don't think they can even do that, because there are like around 40 million of us. So, but it looks genocidal, because you're trying to get away not just with the state, but also with the culture, also with the language, and killing a lot of people in the process. The people who are actually the main carriers of this genophond, if you like, genotype of national culture. Because the Russian troops, when they were coming to certain cities and towns in Ukraine, they always had the list of people they need to detain. Kill, or detain, or torture, or isolate. Mostly the people who are pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western, pro-NATO, like myself. You know, that's why one of the reasons I moved out of Odessa when I saw the war starting. Odessa was, for my taste, too close to the front line. You know, and I've been hearing about this list even prior to February 24th, and that unfortunately turned out true. But also on this list, you know, people who are teaching Ukrainian language in the high school, for instance. So it's not just a politician or an expert or former military or active military personnel. It's also people who are teaching Ukrainian culture in a university or in a school. You know, so they are completely aware of their aim is to de-Ukrainize Ukraine. All right? They're saying there is no such thing as Ukrainians. They're just Russians. They don't realize. They're mistaken. They speak wrong language. We'll teach them Russian. You know, they burn the books, as you know. You know, they try to switch to force Ukrainian teachers in the schools in occupied lands to switch to their curriculum. You know, they burn books. They take away from the library Ukrainian language books and so on. So how does it look? It looks like ethnic cleansing. You know, so that's what it is. So that's why, and again, I'll be focusing on this on Wednesday, like that's why Ukraine can't quite quit. You know, what do you mean quit? I mean, if we quit, if we stop resisting, then Russia continues to go forward, and then the entire existence of our, not just state, you know, but entire nation and the national culture is under serious threat. So maybe some final considerations here. I think the role of Germany is huge in all of this. I think that Germany is very much reluctant in some ways, and I understand why. You know, I am by my first degree actually historian, and then I switched into political science, international relations. But so I understand completely the entire list of factors that are shaping into Germany and Germans being reluctant on playing maybe a bigger role internationally, including specifically the role related to use of military weapons and army and personnel in fighting outside of Germany. You know, I remember what kind of debate there was in the 1990s actually among Germans on Yugoslavia, how we should be involved or not involved, and how Germans remain divided in this issue actually. Should have they been part of this massive collective effort to deal with former Yugoslavia or not? But whether you like it or not, it's a big country which has not claims, but objectively is a guardian of some of the European values right now and principles. And this war that Russia is waging in Ukraine is very much about values and principles. All right, because what they're violating there is values and principles and norms. And Germans believe in norms. You know, and I like it. And that's, I think, is a stronger feature of a German society, that people think that norms should exist. And people who break the norms and break the rules and break the principles that we are depending on are violators, and they should be punished. And therefore Russia should be punished, both for breaking the rules. And there is also international order. But there is also a self-interest. There is also security. Like Germany is part of NATO and EU, so what Russia is doing is threatening the rest of Europe. So, and of course, Germany is playing a big role in supplying weapons to Ukraine, and Germany playing a huge role in supplying the money to Ukraine. And by the way, of course, Americans, people like Trump and others, are saying, well, but we're giving so much money to Ukraine, what about Europeans? And the answer is like, what about Europeans? Europeans actually given more. You know, and most Americans don't realize that, that if you put together all the money that is given by European Union as a whole, plus European Union member states together to Ukraine, it's more now than Americans have been given to Ukraine. And of course, it's not just weapons, it's also something for Ukrainian government to function, because you need to give people pensions, you need to get, you need to have the government function. You know, it's not okay just to give money for the weapons. Like some people in the US now, in this debate about US assistance to Ukraine, they say, okay, we're okay for giving assistance, so Ukrainians have weapons, but no direct supply, no direct support to the government. That's not how it works. You know, if we have our military keeping the line on the front line, but at the same time the government unraveling, for instance, not able to exist, you know, that's already kind of a victory for Russia and a defeat for Ukraine. So there should be both. And of course, Germany is leading the way in terms of supporting Ukrainian refugees. A huge number of them, of course. Germany is a big country and quite well developed. And for this, people like myself, my friends, we are always be very grateful. That would never be forgiven. We would never forgive this assistance that we've received from Germans and others, and in this time of need. No one expected us to be needing to have this flight, this exodus from Ukraine, when you have millions of people living, not only refugees outside of Ukraine, but also a lot of internally displaced persons in Ukraine, who are actually even in a worse situation. Because the refugees, at least, they have the support of the governments in the countries where they found themselves, like Germany. Very generous support too, thanks to you, people in this room and others. But IDPs, the internally displaced persons, they are, say, left without their job, without their apartment in a different part of the country. They still need to rent a place to live, to feed their family. Their kids have to go to school, and so on, and people lost all their savings in their apartments back home because they've been occupied by Russia or destroyed by Russia. So it's a very difficult situation, and that's where I would like to conclude by saying again and again, and I would never be shy of doing this, that we are eternally grateful to all people around the world in whatever way helping Ukraine to get through this. Is it helping us by sending us weapons because we need to defend ourselves against a mortal enemy, or helping, our pensioners, retirees, or who need to get their salaries and get buy some foodstuff, or hosting refugees, mostly, of course, as you know, women and children from Ukraine. Whatever you're doing, or if someone is just praying for Ukraine, that counts too. That counts too. So thank you very much, and I'd like to stop here. Thank you.
Volodymyr. We will now have the opportunity to ask questions, and we will see how many there are. Maybe we should have them in groups of three, if that is convenient for you. Yeah. I don't know. Will we be using this microphone?
Yes, so that it can be
yes.
also in the
So maybe if I switch it to on, maybe it will start working. Yes. Does it work? Yes, I do. All right. So, please, are there questions, comments? Who wants to go first?
Don't be shy.
Please
you can ask any sort of questions, not necessarily related to what I said, but more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have the question about the role of US, so America, and I want to say the example, the war in Georgia in 2008.
Right.
And as I know from my own experience also, the America played a great role to stop Russia, because Russia could in 1 or 2 hours attack Georgia, and the Tbilisi, the capital city of Georgia, could fall in a couple of hours. but America played a great role there to stop. And what is the role of America in this war, and what are the differences now? Why could not U.S. play the more role, so to say? Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great question. Well, actually, I think there is more similarities than differences in these two situations. And by the way, I'm really glad you brought it up, because it's a good teaching moment, I think. We need to put the ongoing current war in a context over a longer period of time and step back for a moment, at least for 15 years, back to 2008, when Russia attacked Georgia. And people said, well, first of all, before August 2008, most experts said that no, Russia would actually stick to defending their two enclaves, unrecognized breakaway regions in Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, but they would never step into Georgia proper, rest of Georgia, but they did, you know, with this war. And then people said, okay, but that's a small country of Georgia. It's unthinkable for, you know, for us to think that Russia would attack Ukraine, which is a much larger country. And they did in 2014 with Crimea and Donbass. But then again, people said, okay, but that's Crimea and Donbass, the two specific regions. There are many pro-Russian people there, so maybe Russia would limit itself to these two regions. But again, it's just impossible to imagine that Russia will attack the rest of Ukraine. But they did in February 2022. So I guess a big teaching moment here is like you should never say never, in the sense that someone says now, but what is the evidence that Russia might attack, let's say, Estonia or Latvia or Romania, you know, but, you know, why not? Actually, if Russia gets away with this current war against Ukraine, they can be emboldened in many other ways. But going back to your original question is that in 2008, the role of US wasn't that great, because Russians knew and Georgians knew that US would not be involved militarily. Back then and now. Nothing changed in that respect, that no one in NATO, including the United States, has ever contemplated, considered to going into their becoming part of the conflict and involved with direct confrontation with Russia. That didn't change and wouldn't change. And that's a very important moment for us in Ukraine to realize when we think now, we're now talking about and seeking some security guarantees for us in the future. Like if someone in Ukraine thinks that we can arrange some kind of security guarantee that next time Russia attacks us, let's say this war is over, but let's say another invasion, that would mean that Americans and others would actually provide troops to defend Ukraine from Russia. Not going to happen. That's not going to change, you know, unless, of course, Ukraine is involved in NATO, invited into NATO. That might change things. But if Ukraine is not within NATO, then there will be no direct military support. So in that respect, in this 15 years, nothing changed. But the European Union at that point of time and the US have been trying to apply some pressure on Russia, but I think Russia just they just did what they wanted to. They've shown to Georgians what they can do. They actually faced the limits of their military preparedness at that point of time, and they've been really horrified by how badly their military performs in that very small conflict against very tiny enemy, because the Georgians in most cases just didn't fight back. They understood that, you know, there's no chance of stopping Russian troops there. So yeah, and they decided, okay, we taught them sort of a lesson, so that's enough, we'll withdraw, you know, and Georgia is terrified. But again, another teaching moment is how the West related to this. And first of all, the US, the new administration come into power, Barack Obama, he announced a reset of policies was on the heels of this. So several months later, he becomes president and he comes to the White House in early 2009, and he says, okay, let's start from scratch, you know, from a blank sheet of paper with Russia, improve our relations, let's do a reset of policies with Russia. And people were like, a lot of people now think that Obama's decision at that point of time was wrong, and initial reaction of Obama administration to Russian aggression against Ukraine since 2014 was wrong. And maybe some other things, like for instance, drawing the red line in Syria, for instance, and saying that if Assad uses chemical weapons against his people, then we'll intervene, and then Assad uses chemical weapons against his people, then Americans don't intervene, which is all understandable. It's a big question there, it's a big debate, and it's a big topic. Like, of course, Americans were involved for so long before that in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they also were involved in Libya reluctantly, and Libya unraveled. Okay, Gaddafi got rid of, but what's happening in Libya is not a success story at all. So if you put it in this context, then you can understand why he and how he reacted in that point of time. But with Europe and NATO as well, I mean, no one, when Russia did what it did to Georgia, no one really cut relations. On the contrary. I actually happened to be here several weeks after Russian aggression in Georgia, in Europe, with a group of Ukrainian experts, and I had some talks in Berlin, including some people with high positions in the committees in the Bundestag. And I was, struck by how they were all blaming Georgia and Saakashvili, how he's such a bad temper, how he did that, how he did that. So basically no criticism of what Russia's been doing. And that's very unfortunate. And of course, NATO still needed Russia for its operation in Afghanistan, and they worked together with Russians, to provide whatever Americans and other European troops needed in Afghanistan through Russia, because the southern distribution network via Pakistan was less and less reliable, so they needed Russia to do that. So actually, a lot of people now say that several years prior to 2022, Putin was looking in all of this, and what he was calculating and what he was getting in his analysis is the West is weak, is timid, they're not going to do much. They might not even support Ukraine with weapons or financial assistance, let alone sending troops, of course, to fight Russians. And that's why he was emboldened. He thought it's a good time, it's just Ukraine. We're going to be fighting against Ukraine, and Ukraine by itself wouldn't have a chance, wouldn't stand a chance. So it's a good question, and thank you. And actually leads me to other observations that I've just expressed. Thank you. Yeah.
Fantastic. Are there other questions, comments? One here.
Oh, we're actually doing one by one, but that's fine. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, okay. You said, of course, you're not a prophet. How this war will end, and you also talked of different definitions of losing or winning. But still, I'm asking myself, what is the strategy in the war? What is the aim? Mm-hmm. Because it's an awful war. It's at full size coast against the Ukraine people on both sides, mm-hmm. And the land. Yes. And you talked about the Ukraine being victorious, Russia being defeated. What would it mean? Mm-hmm. And what can it mean after the strategy of the last year did not work, right. To get the routes to Crimea? Mm-hmm. Crimea? Yeah. And so what's the strategy? Yeah. Because somehow this war has to be ended. And,
right. Well, the strategy is evolving. I mean, there is no such thing as we have one set of strategy, say, a year ago, and it's the same 1 year later. It's actually evolving under the influence of things happening on the ground. And for instance, last year, when we fought back successfully in a number of places, and Russians left from Kyiv, Chernihiv region under pressure of Ukrainian troops, and then there was, in the summer, very successful Ukrainian offensive in the Kharkiv region, and then, of course, later in the fall, Kherson was liberated in the south. That all led to a lot of people to believe that Ukraine might be getting towards victory, because Russian troops unraveled. Ukrainian troops we've been trained abroad and given new weapons, and especially in the early this year, been a lot of decisions being made to give Ukraine more contemporary weapons, including tanks like Leopards and other things. But then things changed because Russia has performed their own act of resilience. They show they have their own staying power. The ideological consolidation within Russia has been in place because Putin is now pretty successful in convincing Russians that this is a big war. It's not just about Ukraine, it's about the future of Russia. If we lose, then we kind of lose Russia, and the West will defeat us. So the war is bigger for us than just the war for Ukraine. But ultimately it comes down to Ukraine. So when we look at all of this from Ukrainian side as well, it all depends on what we can do. And now there is a growing realization within Ukraine that, okay, maybe in coming months we wouldn't be able to liberate all our occupied lands because the Russian defense is very much entrenched. There is a lot of bitterness about it, domestically, politically. Some people are even angry about Zelensky promising that he would definitely be able to preside over liberation of all our occupied lands. So many people are actually angry about the West dragging their feet and providing more weapons to Ukraine at the right point of time. There is a predominant point of view within Ukraine. If that goes like this: if Ukraine had the weapons that we have now, let's say a year ago, that would be a different story, because Russia was still not having all these defensive lines in the south and east, and with new tanks and everything and armored carriers and other things, Ukrainian troops would be able to much further advance against the Russian troops. But it is what it is. What happened has happened. Time was lost, and Russia created this very impressive, very entrenched defensive line in the south and the east of Ukraine. We're now losing too many of our people, on the front line. Russians are losing even more, but they don't care, because of course the population reserve is different. It's three times more, or even more than 3 times more population. And Russia also is an authoritarian country, so to mobilize people in such a country is much easier than in a democratic, open society kind of country like Ukraine. So that's not to mention things that are mentioned before, like the natural resources, like the money they can fund the war, like the weapons they can produce. We can't produce them. We completely rely on supply of weapons from outside of Ukraine. So because you can't have production line in Ukraine, because Russians would find it and bomb it, right? So you have to get these weapons from somewhere else. So yeah, it's changing a little bit, the attitudes, a sobering up. It's a grim moment in the public mood, political leadership as well, because Zelensky has enjoyed for a long period of time his status of kind of a rock star, superstar, when he was like welcomed everywhere and people were listening and standing up and applauding and supporting Ukraine. Now it doesn't work that way anymore. He's having less and less of success in lobbying for Ukraine, and that makes him angry, and it makes him despair things. He's still trying, of course, and he has to, because he's president of Ukraine. Domestically, politically, there is more of blame game going on around now. Like, okay, when we were successfully defending or even liberating our lands, that's great. We're all together. There is a lot of success to be shared by everyone, political leadership, military. But now when something is going wrong and we lose our guys and we're not moving forward at the front line, then okay, the political leadership said maybe military is doing something else. The military is then saying, okay, maybe political leadership is doing something else. And there is some grudge and some grievances among them. And the West is basically saying, like you said, like, okay, maybe it's time for you to stop, to try and resolve it militarily only. The problem is for Ukraine, though, is, like I said, if we stop, then what would Russia do? Would they be actually okay? Would they even be content with the land that they control in Ukraine right now? Quite probably not. Quite probably they're going to continue producing more weapons and do another round of mobilization and try to continue to attack Ukrainian territory. Because the ultimate goal for them, like I said, is complete control over Ukraine. Not in terms of occupying entire Ukraine, but in terms of actually having more influence in Ukraine than they currently have. Because currently they only control this little 4 regions, even 4 oblasts, 4 units, and 3 out of 4 are not completely. So that's not enough for them. So our strategy then depends on resilience of Ukrainian people, what's going on with Ukrainian military, what's happening with weapons supply. If this thing will be solved, I hope so, in the US Congress in the coming weeks, maybe after the Christmas break already, and this money will be given to Ukraine for another year. That will be a breathing moment kind of for us, a moment to work for another year. And Europeans, of course, are watching Americans closely. There is this big debate in Europe, like, can we actually do it without US? And there is no one resolute answer to this question. Can we or can't we? As you know, there's been this huge debate within Europe about this strategic autonomy and other things, maybe European army, what can we do if US is out of Europe, so to speak. But it's more of a debate still than actual real preparation. European Union, for instance, promised us 1 million shells, 155 caliber. So far, it's even less than half of that been provided to Ukraine. We're hungry for this. So we'll see. Like I said, the strategy very much is becoming more realistic, less of like optimal case scenario for us, but more like what we can actually do. Because no one in Ukraine wants to continue losing our military at the scale that we have now. Because it would not be helpful in terms of trying to liberate the occupied lands, but it would also deplete our resources personnel, human resources on the battleground, in the sense that Russia might actually take upper hand, and start another round of offensive against Ukrainian exhausted, depleted troops. There's been very little rotation. A lot of Ukrainian soldiers and officers have been there for like 18, 20 months now. They're completely exhausted. So it's hard war, and there's now realization in Kyiv and with military as well, and with our allies that, okay, maybe we need to adjust our war aims, so to speak, for now. And then there's a big debate lingering out there, like, should Ukraine be invited into NATO or EU? Like with NATO, for instance, there's this new idea on the ground, on the surface, that maybe the Ukraine, which is currently controlled by Ukrainian government, should be invited into NATO, but those territories controlled by Russia not. I'm not myself necessarily convinced that it's workable, that it's feasible, that you can do something like that, but there is some thinking about what we can do right now, because if some people felt some euphoria last year about Russia being too weak and we can actually defeat it, this year is a different mood in the West and in Ukraine. Like, it's not that easy to defeat them. It's a huge country, with a lot of entrenchment themselves, and people consolidating around Putin and things like that, and people believing his propaganda that the West is out to get us. They want to destroy us. Of course, in Ukraine, we don't have any such goals. Like when I say defeat Russia, I don't mean Ukrainian and American troops marching in the victory parade in the Red Square. No, we only need to get back the land that they took away from us. That's all. That's 100% of victory ceiling that we have in Ukraine. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to add a little question / comment of my own.
Okay.
When I think back 105 years in history, the German army was standing in France, occupying Belgium and large parts of northeastern France and central France even. It was continuously attacking in the Emperor's Offensive and so on, the St. Michael's Offensive and so on, which were operationally successful for some time and driving back even Allied troops, until it all collapsed because Germany could not feed their forces and could not supply the raw materials needed to continue. Now I am hearing receiving news from several sources that no eggs are available anymore at in Russian cities and towns and so on, because the labor power that goes into food production is apparently crowded out by military production, which offers unbelievably higher salaries, and so on and so on. I'm also seeing credible news that commercial flights within Russia are not starting, or there have even been several crashes or other sorts of irregularities in Russian air traffic because they're not getting their turbines serviced anymore. So, long story short, are we seeing the beginning of a Russian systemic atrophy in more economic terms than military terms?
It's a great question, Bob. We've been waiting for this moment for a long time, but I'm afraid that Russians are mostly fine with having difficulties and shortages in their daily lives when it's explained like we need to do this, go through this. In a collective psyche, mentality, tightening the belts is okay, because Putin tells them we are being attacked. It's not just about Ukraine. Ukraine is just some player the West uses, Americans primarily, against us. So they are out to get Russia. They want to destroy Russia. They want to put us back on the knees, and so on. So in this big conversation on such an issue, who cares about eggs? Like, can you buy the eggs or not? Or who cares about little things like accidents with airplanes? So I think there is a different breaking point. Maybe there's no breaking point at all. Maybe Putin can always explain, like, what are you talking about? We have this priority, we have this war, we need to see through. So all of our resources and everything, all our attention is given to this war. It's a decisive, it's existential moment for us. I mean, he's lying, of course, because Russia can actually exist as an independent country even while losing the war. Unlike Ukraine, we can't lose the war because we wouldn't be existing as an independent nation. But he's saying, yeah, they're going to destroy us. They're going to just, I don't know, grab our land, our natural resources. Russia would be into pieces and so on. So I'm afraid that he has successfully operating under this model of besieged fortress. You know, that everyone is an enemy against us, which helps him to mobilize the support within the country. Some people who are not agreeing with him, many have left, even better with him. So that's one of the reasons why he was not preventing a lot of Russians leaving from Russia. Because he had, under his regime, he had all the tools in place, if he wanted to. When Russians started leaving, not wanting to be part of the mobilization effort, he would just, you know, put the brake on the borders, but he didn't. So he said, okay, better have all those people out of Russia. So I am here left with people who are completely believing my message. So in that respect, I'm semi-hopeful, you know, half hopeful that there's something is happening in Russia which would diminish their ability to continue to wage the war. But at the same time, I'm also not very hopeful because I know that I can actually focus exclusively on the war effort at the expense of other things. And because it's one of the things why they're caring so much about this Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, what they call the Great Patriotic War, is that gives him a legacy, you know, the reason, the parallel, the analogy that he says, okay, we survived then. And it was very difficult, and the German troops were in the middle of Russia and everything, but we still prevailed. So this time we're going to prevail again. Just stop complaining about things like X, you know, and lack of freedom and everything, and democracy. And I'm going to be with you as long as I'm alive. You know, they just allowed him to be president until 2030. I don't know, maybe 2130 or something, if they invent some mechanism to keep him alive forever. So he's fine. I think he was trembling at some point of time. I think he was really worried about what's going on domestically, politically. You know, is he fully in control of military, like with this Prigozhin episode? Is he fully in control of economic elites? Or maybe people would say we're losing so much money because of this war, so Mr. Putin stopped the war. But all of this fear seemed to be evaporated for him. And I think he is regaining control. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there further questions, comments? Yes,
Yeah.
two, one here, one there. I don't know who was first, but...
Okay.
Yes, the great European humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam, who wrote 15 books against war, would say maybe war is the most stupidity in mankind. And this is a very nice example which we show. One question I have, what is your position concerning the Catholic Church and our Pope and his position concerning the war in Ukraine? This is one question. And also I think we underestimate maybe the Russian power. If you look now in the world order, we have the multipolar world order, they have friends in China, in Arabia, and even I think they are even stronger now before the war, okay? And I think in the future, what you will see is that they will integrate the territory they occupied in the law from you. Maybe they overrun Ukraine in the end, okay? Because if you have fight, I fight. If you fight, you know, if you're weak, if you're wounded, and the other has more power, you're on the losing side.
Yes.
And this is what we see now. And I'm not sure what will be the end of all this for the security of Europe. And I think the only winner we have on this war is the industrial complex, okay, of technology. We spend $500 billion for stupid weapons. Every day 500 people die on the battlefield. And for what? Okay.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I guess there is no just a military solution to this. There should be a complex solution. That's why I say sanctions need to continue to work, in addition to weapons supply to Ukraine and political pressure on Russia as well, and working on cutting supply from other countries to Russia. If you can, there's been a lot of pressure on China, obviously, because China stands with Russia in many ways. But luckily enough for us in Ukraine, fortunately enough, they're not sending tons of weapons to Russia. They sometimes, of course, send a lot of things that Russia can use for their military production, but still not weapons as such. So if you apply this together with some ostracism, some criticism of Russia within international structures. That might still work, you know, but as Johan mentioned, that there's been some signs coming from Russia that they're not quite comfortable. So, but of course, no one wants this war to end more than Ukrainians themselves. So that's a very important statement, I think, for me to make. And as a Ukrainian, on behalf of many Ukrainians, and I know most Ukrainians share this. So we all desperate for the war to end. For us to be living not under the sirens all the time, not to go to bomb shelters, to see our loved ones, for those of us who are abroad, you know, to start recovering things, for Odessa port to be working not under blockade, and for mines not to be floating in the Black Sea and so on. And no one wants more than this, you know, than Ukrainians. But we all understand that there is price to pay. I mean, if we stop the war on Russian conditions, that is terrible, you know, and that's actually inviting more war in the future. So that's one of the things, you know. Unfortunately, that reminds me of the First World War, when many people fought because they wanted this to be the last war, you know, for no wars to be happening after the First War. That didn't happen, you know. There was another, of course, but in Ukraine, it's very unfortunate that we have to go through this. We don't feel any guilt. Why is it happening to us? We don't quite understand. You know, we think that this war was unprovoked, you know, because, you know, like, what is our fault? Just that we want to exist as a nation, as a country. That's all. You know, we didn't do any like anti-Russian things. We didn't start attacking Russia until recently, when, of course, in the hybrid warfare, you also send drones into some adjacent Russian territories. You're trying, you know, to basically, you know, scare them a little bit. Not that it is working, but so yeah, I think that maybe there is no military solution as such against such a big country as Russia, which is having so much resources. But then at least we should maybe limit their ability to wage the war. And that's why Ukraine should be supported militarily in the future, like, okay, maybe not invited into NATO, but given enough weapons. And we have more of experienced military now, and the price, if Russia continues to attack Ukraine, will increase on them to the certain level when the next time they would think, okay, maybe it's not worthy to attack Ukraine anymore because we're kind of not getting much. It becomes a Pyrrhus victory, like, you know, Pyrrhus, yeah, yeah, Pyrrhus victory, it's kind of victory for us, but the price is so huge that we'd rather not. All right, so maybe something like that. Because the asymmetry has been cut into. It's asymmetric conflict. Russia is stronger than Ukraine, but if you support Ukraine, then it becomes less asymmetric. So maybe that's the logic. But you're right. I mean, maybe there is no, you know, exactly purely militarily way to deal with this.
What is the church?
Oh, the church. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, the church playing a huge role. Actually, I mean, the Franciscus himself, Francesco, the Pope. He's been saying all sorts of things. You know, sometimes he would invite Ukrainians and pray for Ukraine, and he would bring Ukrainian children from Mariupol and other places on stage with him and pray with him. And everyone in Ukraine, of course, is very grateful. But on other days, he would say that Russia is, you know, we need to be friendly with Russia and so on. And talking to Russian children the other day, a few weeks ago, he said that he likes Russian culture and he likes Russian history of empire and stuff like that. So, you know, he's saying different kind of things. But basically, the church is playing a huge role in Ukraine with Roman Catholic Church. And also, as you probably know, we have a Greek Catholic Church, so which is like halfway between full, you know, the 100% Roman Catholic version and an Orthodox Christian version. And they were active in helping the troops, in helping the people in need, in hosting people. A lot of Ukrainian internally displaced persons are actually in Western Ukraine, where you have most of those Roman Catholics and Greek Catholics. The Catholics around the world are helping a lot of Ukrainians too through their structures. One of the leading universities in Ukraine is called Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, which is a great university. They do a lot too, a lot of projects. So aside from what Pope says or doesn't say, you know, the Catholic structures on the ground are actually very supportive of Ukraine. Very supportive of Ukraine. We're seeing it. There are a lot of humanitarian assistance, you know, from early days of the war. Caritas, I think, this one structure, big structure there, and others. that are helping people, with what we need. If they need to eat something, if they need warm blankets, for the military it's a different thing. You don't expect church to actually help the military directly, but for the people, civilians who are the victims of the war, I think the Catholic structures on the ground has done quite a lot. Yeah. So that's probably was time for the last, or unless there is someone else.
There was another question here.
Oh, please, yes. Yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if you notice any changes in the support of Ukraine now that the public attention is shifting away towards the Middle East conflict.
Yeah, of course. Not only that, but the longer this war rages, that's another challenge for us, of course. The more natural is for the people to, wander away. And that's only natural. That's in human nature. I mean, Ukrainians are often upset, but I talk to them and I give a lot of interviews for Ukrainian media. And I tell them, look, people move on, they're terrified initially what Russia is doing to Ukraine, but they cannot be glued and fixed to TV screens forever. People have other concerns, in other parts of the world or domestically. They care about more. With all sympathies, there is a limit to what they can do. They can host Ukrainian refugees, or their support maybe their government giving some money to Ukraine or even some weapons to Ukraine, but what else can you expect of them? No one in the world would be worried about the war on the same level as Ukrainians are. It's only natural. And I often say to them, like, for instance, there was this huge, terrible, continuous in many ways, bloody war in Syria ever since 2011. 500,000 people died, maybe more. And I'm telling, like, you Ukrainians, for instance, the people watching this TV blog where I'm giving an interview, have you cared too much? And a lot of people are like, frankly, probably not. Did you actually go to watch the TV news like about what happened in Syria last night or something? No. So why are you suddenly all then expecting, that everyone drops what they've been doing and helping Ukraine, and that becomes their priority for the rest of their days? So I guess not. So I guess that's only natural. And of course, the distracting attention with what's happening in Gaza and the Middle East is another thing here. The influence of China in the Asian Pacific region. So much of that criticism is misguided. But in the West, also, I think this country has been trying to be focusing on both Russian aggression and what's happening in Gaza, even though quite limited in what they can do. And of course, with Gaza, there's no easy solutions. Like, what do you do? What kind of steps can you offer, except that you're kind of hoping that they will stop killing each other, but what practical steps can you make to make this happen? That's when it becomes troublesome for Washington and other capitals in the West. Like, what can you do for this Israeli-Palestinian carnage to stop? It's not easy, and it's been ongoing for a long time. I mean, it's just another latest round of violence there, unfortunately. Yeah. Thank you. All right.
Before closing this event, I would like to remind you again that on Wednesday there's another opportunity to speak to Professor Dubovik. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Interest.
Yeah.
And have a nice evening.
All right. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you.